Welcome to the In the Course Show. I am your host, Mr. B. Today we have a very exciting show for you. We are analyzing some predictions made by Professor Jiang. Now, Professor Jiang is a professor who has traditionally guessed correctly the outcomes of elections and a lot of political dealings. He's built a reputation for himself as being pretty correct. He recently did an interview on Tucker Carlson, and he's done some other predictions and videos on his own channel. And I came across a few of them and thought it'd be interesting to share it as we analyze and try to make sense of what's going on with this war. What could some of Trump's motivations be for keeping it going as long as it has? And, you know, what the potential outcomes may be as a result of him prolonging this war. Now, Professor Jiang has a few theories that we're going to analyze in this video. So let's go ahead and jump into that.
Asking me right now, why is Trump doubling down in Iran? Why is he sending more troops? Why isn't he just declaring victory and coming home? And I think most people are missing what's actually happening here. This isn't about Iran. This isn't about oil. This isn't even about China. This is about Trump's survival. And I want to walk you through why I believe Trump cannot end this war. Because if he loses power, he goes to prison. Now, before we get into this, I need you to understand something about how empires behave when they're in decline. And this is really important because if you don't understand this pattern, you won't understand what's happening right now in the Middle East. When empires are failing, they suffer from a very specific and lethal combination of both hubris and desperation. They become so arrogant that they refuse to consider the possibility of defeat. And at the same time, they're so desperate for a knockout punch that they continue to escalate. And this is exactly what we're seeing with Trump right now. Let me explain the game theory here, because this is crucial. Trump cannot afford to leave office. And we know this because we know exactly what happened in his first term. Remember the raid on Mar-a-Lago? Remember all the lawfare against Trump? Remember the court cases that almost bankrupted him? So you can imagine that there are a lot of people who want revenge for what Trump is doing in his second term. The Democrats have made it very clear that if they come back to power, they're going after him and his family. This isn't speculation. We've seen this play out already. So Trump's personal calculus right now is very simple. How do I stay in power? And staying in power through the ballot box is extremely risky. But if he starts a war, and this war is at first supported by both Democrats and Republicans, but then slowly this war spirals out of control, and then there's unrest in America, in which case he's forced to send in the National Guard, and then he's forced to call a national draft in order to protect American interests in the Middle East. Then he can conceivably stay in power for as long as this war continues. And we know this is possible because of what happened with Zelensky in Ukraine. Remember, because of the war in Ukraine, they suspended their constitution. They suspended elections, and Zelensky is still in power. In fact, when Zelensky visited Trump in the White House, Trump asked him, "Hey, you can really do that?" And Zelensky said, "You like this, don't you?" So I think, unfortunately, that is going through the mind of Trump right now. But let me step back, because a lot of people are saying, can't Trump just declare victory and go home? And the problem with this is, if Trump were to leave the Middle East, basically the American empire would collapse. So let me explain to you what would happen if Trump just said, you know what, I killed the leadership, I destroyed the nuclear weapons program, I set back the ballistics program, everything I wanted to accomplish, I've already accomplished, I'm going to go home, goodbye. Here's what happens. Iran would say to the GCC, hey, you destroyed our country, you have to pay back reparations. If you don't pay back reparations, first of all, we'll continue to attack you and destroy your oil infrastructure. And second of all, we won't let you use the Strait of Hormuz. And so now the GCC is forced to take $4 trillion in sovereign wealth funds. Before, this money was going to the United States. Now it's going to Iran to rebuild their economy and infrastructure and their military. But then the Japanese and the South Koreans are looking at this, and they're thinking, well, we just saw what happened. The Americans attacked Iran, Iran fought back and destroyed the GCC, and the Americans refused to defend the GCC. Remember, the entire point of the petrodollar agreement is that Americans would guarantee the security of the GCC. And when this war started, what happened? The Americans abandoned their bases, changed into civilian clothes, and moved into hotels because they could not stop the Iranians from raining drones and ballistic missiles on their bases. So the South Koreans and the Japanese will say, okay, well, we can't trust the Americans, so we need to remilitarize as soon as possible. Let's just not depend on the Americans and remilitarize. But what that also means is they stop buying US treasuries. And so the US dollar loses buyers from the Middle East and loses buyers from East Asia. And the dollar could potentially collapse in value. And now America has $40 trillion in debt, which forces an economic crisis in America. A great reset, financial depression. You'll have riots in the streets. And then you go to Europe. The Europeans are saying the Americans are suffering from depression, and the Americans are not able to defend their allies. Why are we fighting the Russians again? Why don't we just come to an agreement with the Russians? Why are we sending our men to die in Ukraine? So now Russia becomes the dominant power in Europe, and Iran becomes the dominant power in the Middle East. And America is imploding back in the Western Hemisphere. Is that a situation that the American government, that Trump, would accept? I don't think it is. So there's really no possibility of America retreating from this war. America can only escalate, unfortunately. Now, let me talk about what's actually happening on the ground right now, because this is where it gets really interesting. Right now, a Marine Expeditionary Force is traveling from Japan to the Middle East. We should expect them to arrive in about a week. There's about 2,000 of them, and they specialize in amphibious landing. So the idea is that they will bombard the coastline of Karg Island, and this will enable the Marines to land and secure the oil deposits of Karg Island. And at this point, Trump will declare victory and try to get the Iranians to the negotiating table and say, listen, I have Karg Island, and this is your economic lifeline. So let's cut a deal that allows us both to save face. And I think that is the plan. But there are a lot of issues with this plan. The first issue is that Karg Island is not as important economically as people believe. Even if you secure Karg Island, Iran has workarounds where they can just ship from the coast. Issue number two is that Iran needs financing for this war, and they're using oil as collateral financing. But if the Chinese and the Russians believe that the Americans want to strangle Iran, it's not in their best interest to see Iran destroyed. So they're going to provide financing anyway. And look, the reality is that now that oil is shooting up in price, this benefits Russia tremendously. Putin can take all these oil riches and finance Iran in fighting this war. Because Russia has the most to lose if Iran loses this war and there's regime change. If Iran were to fall, this opens up the Russian southern flank to the Americans, because Azerbaijan is an Israeli-American ally. And if Iran were to fall, then the Americans and Israelis could stage operations from the south. But here's the most important problem. Once you take Karg Island, you expose the Marines to drone strikes and artillery strikes from the coast, which means that you now need to send in more Marines to secure the coast. So you send in 2,000, 3,000 troops to secure Karg Island. Done that easily. But they can't secure the island against Iranian drones. So the only way you can do that is by taking the coastline along Karg Island. You do that with tens of thousands of Marines. But then you expose these Marines to attacks from the mountains, the Zagros Mountains, these drones, these missiles from the Zagros Mountains, which means that now you have to invest 100,000 troops to go after Iran's underground missile facilities. And this is exactly what happened in Vietnam. The great irony of all this is that the Marine Expeditionary Force that is going to Iran is the same force that went into Vietnam and marked the first major ground involvement of the Americans in about 1965. They went into Da Nang and secured the Air Force Base. And at first it was like 3,500 soldiers, and that was supposed to be it. Like 5 years later, you're at 500,000 American soldiers. So once you send in ground troops, it creates a logic, a momentum of its own. And then you have mission creep, and then sunk cost fallacy, and then eventually you have a national draft. And that is the great danger of taking Karg Island at this point. Now, I want to be very clear about what I think is going to happen, because I think Trump is going to take Karg Island. He'll do it very easily. And then he'll want to secure the coast as well. And so you have mission creep. And unfortunately, he's being egged on by both Israel and the GCC, because Israel clearly wants this war to escalate. The GCC wants to remove the Iranian threat as soon as possible, because they see the amount of damage that the Iranians can do to the GCC. So Dubai, if nothing changes, Dubai will just cease to exist, because Dubai is just based on the perception that it's a safe tax haven. But if Iran can just rain drones on Dubai uncontested, then no one's going to put their money in Dubai. So for Dubai to continue to thrive, it needs to destroy Iran and remove that threat from the Middle East. So unfortunately, the way that things are structured suggests that this war can only escalate and not actually move towards a ceasefire. And Trump, because of his personal situation, because of the threat of prison, because of what the Democrats have promised to do to him if he leaves office, he cannot afford to back down. He cannot afford to admit defeat. He can only double down. And this is the pattern we see with empires in decline. They become so arrogant and so insular that they refuse to consider the possibility of defeat. So they always double down. And I don't know how you resolve this issue. It isn't going to be easy, that is for sure. So when people ask me, how does this end? I have to tell them, I don't think it ends well. I think we're looking at a protracted conflict. I think we're looking at mission creep. I think we're looking at a national draft. And I think we're looking at Trump using this war to stay in power, because the alternative for him is prison. And that's not a choice. That's an existential threat. And people facing existential threats don't make rational decisions. They make survival decisions.
Wow. Professor Jiang raised some really, really good points about Trump's motivations, and whether or not Trump is actually creating this war, similar to how Netanyahu, the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, how in wartime, they have these war power acts that allows them to do things like freeze the elections and pretty much change the way that their elections are handled because they're in war. And his estimation is that the calculation for Trump is if he's not in power, then he most certainly, and his party loses, then he most certainly on a chopping block. So his estimation is that Trump is going to try to prolong the war as long as possible so that he can stay in power and control what happens. Now, this is an interesting point because I do think power is really a tempting, tantalizing drug, right? Fame, power, notoriety. You know, Trump obviously is a guy who likes the spotlight and has always been a guy who liked the spotlight, right? You know, from when he came into, into his own in the real estate market in New York, Trump was able to make a name for himself, you know, expanding his father's business that was based in some of the boroughs like Queens and Brooklyn, and expanding it into Manhattan, which was a bigger, yard to play in, if you will. And so ever since Trump got the spotlight, he's been in the spotlight, and I believe he loves the spotlight. I think having been president and some of the things he's been able to accomplish is probably a bit intoxicating for him. And it's quite true that you may not want to walk away from power like that. Now, I do believe that for a guy like Trump, who's done a lot of things professionally in his career, being president, which was something that was always talked about since in the 80s, comes with a lot more challenges. It keeps him on his toes. It keeps him sharp. It gives him something to do. Obviously, this man has done real estate deals. He's passed that business down to his family. His kids are handling it. And now he's trying to build his legacy. And I think he sees his position as president as a good way of going about building his legacy. And so one of the things that may be tough for him to do is to walk away from that spotlight. Because I think you find purpose when you're going out into some of these rallies and 100,000 people are showing up or 50,000 people are showing up and they're screaming your name. They're wearing your name on their body with regards to your clothing and stuff of that nature. That stuff is intoxicating, right? Anyone will get caught in that limelight. So it is quite possible, because Trump has joked around about expanding into a third term, even though there may be limitations in the Constitution that prevents him from doing that. He's trying to find a way to do that to expand his power. Professor Jiang seems to reasonably think that Trump is so committed to that, to holding on to power so much so, for a few reasons. One, because it's intoxicating and it's hubris, but also for the fact that without him being in power, he can't protect himself and his family from being on the chopping block. So as long as he's in power, then they won't be threatened. And you can see examples of that because Netanyahu, a lot of people say that's what he's done in Israel, is that there are a group of people that are not exactly big fans of him, and he's managed to keep himself relevant by always creating conflicts that has essentially given the people a reason to allow him to stay in office. And this is his calculation. You've seen similar things with Zelensky. Russia at one point questioned his legitimacy as a president because his term has expired, yet he's still in power under these war time laws that allows him to still operate the country. And Professor Jiang seems to think there's a similar thing here happening with Trump. I don't know if I'm all the way on that. I can understand the emphasis on his part to try to stay in power, but there's a lot of different ways that Trump could try to maintain power. I would have thought that he would have had one of his sons run for office or one of his kids run for office. His name is still good. And if one of his kids ran for office, they can ensure that he's protected, and that's another 8 years, similar to how the Bushes did it, right? That's one of the things that you would think that could be a possibility. But also, he raised up a few points about when a particular superpower is at a point in history where they're about to be expired, they start to do desperate things. And a lot of times the Bible says pride is the root of all evil. It comes before the fall. Pride comes before the fall. And so what happens is you get this boastful temperament, if you will, where because you have the biggest military, because you have the biggest guns, because you have the largest economies, because America's the hottest place, you start feeling like you're invincible and therefore could do anything you want. And you start to underestimate the power and the might and the will of others who may not feel like it's okay for you to bully them because they stand on different principles. And I think there's a little bit of that going on. I don't want to jump the gun and say there's a lot of it, but I would say there's a little bit of it. I hear it a lot when I hear like the Pete Hegseth and he talks. I mean, he's a Secretary of War, I get it, but I just feel like there's got to be a little more decorum when you're talking. When you're talking about taking people's lives and war and things that's very serious, especially in front of a hot mic or a press conference, when you come across like you are going to compromise rules of engagement and you're going to, take people out and you're going to do these things, it comes across like you have no regard for human life. And anybody who's watching that may want to be sympathetic to your cause, that may want to see the story the way you want them to see it, they become disheartened, if you will. I mean, at least that's how I felt a couple of times when I watched these guys talk, and they're talking about bombing a school, and he's talking like, kind of like it's not a thing. And I think that's where the disconnect starts to take place. It's where you start being mindful of human life, and you're giving people the impression that, you know, it's just a casualty of war. And if there's no sense of value for human life, and you are totally willing to deprive even innocent women, men, and children of life solely to handle vendettas, I think you lose the support that you want to have with the world. You want the world to be able to rally around you and to get behind your cause. And if they feel like you're doing this really to flex muscles, and you're doing this for your own reasons to brag, or you're doing this for the sake of your own ego, then you lose people. It's off-putting, you know what I mean? And it's just off-putting. And I don't know that there's anyone really who's tapped into that sensitive side. Optically, how does it come across when you go on national television, and you come across as if you have a disregard for human life, especially innocent civilians. Now I understand war is war. It comes with casualties, people die, and it's a tough reality of that. And I don't envy any of these guys to be in the position that they are, because you got to sleep with that on your conscience. So that's not an easy thing to do. So and this is one of the reasons I encourage people to pray, for our leaders, because they have to make some of these decisions. But at the same time, too, I do think when it comes to this particular thing, you do have to speak about it as if you do have some sort of regard for human life. You do have to have some sensitivity to how things look optically. And I think there's been parts in this process, like the bombing of the Iranian school, where there was more like puffing my chest talk, and not more like, that was an accident. We may have gotten wrong information. No, like, care there. And that matters to people. That matters to people when you have little to no disregard for life. That's going to rub people the wrong way, and they're not going to get behind your schedule or behind your narrative or your mission, because they're like, I don't want to associate myself with anything that I perceive to be cruel and a reckless disregard for human life. I'm a Christian. Like, why would I sign on to you bombing a children's school? Like, you know what I mean? I think that's where a lot of, critics of this come from. They come from we have some regard for human life, and we may have understand that some wrongs may have been done from one part to the other. But whenever the reaction to that wrong is more wrong being inflicted on innocent civilians, especially women and children, that's where people can't tolerate seeing that over and over and over again for an extended period of time without feeling sympathetic for those people, and thinking and empathizing for them, and saying, how would I feel if me and my little child was just being bombed, and I'd have to witness death from people who's got nothing to do with the conflict every day. And that's when people, when they have that human connection to what's going on. I mean, I've seen some things where like kids was being insinuated. That doesn't sit easy on the spirit, especially if you got little kids. That doesn't sit easy in the spirit. And if you have an imagination where you can imagine or empathize or put yourself in someone's shoes, you wouldn't necessarily want that. So I think having leaders that are sensitive to that matters. And I think there's parts of Trump's character that is, his whole motivation for wanting to stop the Ukrainian and Russian war has been one of the reasons that he talked about, is the fact that there's a lot of innocent people, even soldiers and stuff, dying. And it's a gruesome scene when you're seeing all these guys in the field dead. They're young, they can't have families. It's something that doesn't sit right with you. And I think at some point we can talk ourselves into convincing ourselves that the other side is so evil that they deserve this. And I don't know that that's our place to make that determination. I understand war is a sticky thing, but if you are going to do it, make sure you're doing it for reasons that are just. You know what I mean? To me, 9/11 is a just reason. You attack us, innocent people is attacked, and now, we got to go and address the problem to ensure that it doesn't happen and to send a message. I get that. In this case, we weren't attacked. We're really kind of sticking up for a friend and taking the friend's word for it. For anybody who's ever been in that, you're out somewhere and you're hanging out and you got that one friend that typically gets into problems with people. And before you know it, you're having to stand up or stand with a friend that tends to, get himself in trouble. And now, because that's your friend, you're involved in some stuff you probably wouldn't have been involved in if you weren't hanging out with that friend that night. So it's like, this is where, we have to be mindful about the company we keep. But at the same time, too, I do think making sure that our ears are sensitive to understanding how, optically how this looks, right? When it comes across like you have little to no regard for human life, it's a tough thing. Now, attacking specifically or addressing specifically the point about him thinking that Trump is fearful that if he leaves office and his enemies get into office, that he would fear for his safety. I don't particularly think that that's the case, because Trump has not been in office. He's been in office for 4 years. He came out of office. His enemies came into power. They persecuted the heck out of him, attacked the heck out of him. And Trump was still as defiant. He still, fought and stood up for himself. And for the most part, he won. He won public opinion about what was being portrayed about him. People were able to see it for what it was, and they put him back in power. Now, there's no opportunity for Trump to get back in power. But I also do think that a lot of, what he's done, especially now that he's got the Protection Act from the Supreme Court saying that things you do as a president, when you're doing it, there's some sort of legal protections you get. I don't believe that was in place when Trump was in his first term. And so, it came into place, later on. And so I don't think that would be something that keeps him now. I think there's other threats that we may not know as the public that he's got to wrestle with. Somebody attempted on his life. There's been a couple of different attempts on this man's life. He's got a big family and a big name. And he's made a lot of people, he's made a lot of enemies. So I'm sure there are some concerns on that part. As a human being, anyone would have those concerns if they've experienced, some of the things that this man has had to go through. I would think that weighs on his mind. But I don't know that I would say that it's solely because he wants to stay into power to do it. There may be some valid points to it. We'll have to see how it plays out. But I don't know that that's the only reason that I would give for why that's the case. Now, he did make another prediction, and he talked about more about the conditions on the ground, and I want to get into that a little bit. Let's see. He's been talking. He made a couple of predictions here. Let's see which ones we're going to tackle. All right, we're going to tackle another one. All right, let's go ahead and click.
Something changed last night. Not
Okay.
in the way most breaking news unfolds. A headline, a reaction, a counter-reaction, and then everything slips back into its normal rhythm. This was not that. This was a kind of shift that does not reverse. And I want to take you through exactly what occurred, what it means, and where the logic of this conflict is now leading. Because if you are only watching the surface level coverage, you are missing the deeper structure of what is taking shape. Let's begin with what we actually witnessed. The Israelis widened their targeting. They moved toward critical infrastructure, not just military assets, not just command centers, infrastructure, the kind of targeting that signals intent. And in response, Iran did something we have not seen at this scale before. They started targeting energy systems, not symbolic strikes, not warning shots, but coordinated, deliberate attacks on the energy framework that the global economy relies on. And the moment that happened, this ceased to be a regional conflict and became something entirely different. To understand why that matters, you have to consider what the Gulf region actually represents. This is not simply a group of countries sitting on oil reserves. This is the physical foundation of modern industrial civilization. Cheap, accessible energy is what allows everything else to function. Your supply chains, your manufacturing systems, your transport networks, your food production, all of it is built on top of energy. Remove that base, even partially, even temporarily, and the effects do not remain contained. They spread outward. Prices shift, supply chains tighten, markets react, and suddenly a conflict that began in one region is felt in places that have nothing to do with the original dispute. So the first thing to understand is that we have crossed a threshold. We have moved from a conflict about territory or political outcomes into something that is targeting the system itself, and that is a fundamentally different kind of war. Now, here is what makes this especially significant. This is not accidental escalation. This is not simple retaliation in the traditional sense where one side responds at roughly the same level to signal resolve and then both sides pause. What Iran is doing is strategic. It reflects a clear understanding of its position. They know they cannot win a conventional war against the United States and its allies. That is not a realistic path. So they are not trying to fight on that battlefield. Instead, they are targeting the system that supports their opponent. They are going after the economic infrastructure that sustains American power projection and its regional partnerships. And that strategy, regardless of how you judge it morally or politically, is coherent. It is designed to impose costs far beyond the battlefield. At the same time, look at what the Israelis and the Americans are pursuing. These are not limited goals. These are not efforts to contain Iran or push it back to some acceptable baseline and then stabilize. These are maximalist objectives. The aim appears to be the fundamental weakening of Iran's ability to function as a coherent state. You can see it in the targeting decisions, leadership, economic nodes, infrastructure. The logic is to create such intense internal pressure that the country fractures from within, that the population turns against the government, that the system collapses under the weight of the damage being inflicted. And here is why that combination is so dangerous. When both sides pursue maximal objectives, there is no natural off-ramp. There is no point where one side can say, we have achieved enough, let's negotiate, because the objectives themselves are absolute. One side is trying to dismantle the other. The other is trying to break the system that supports its opponent. Neither goal has a midpoint. Neither can be partially achieved and declared sufficient. And so what you get is a structural condition for continuous escalation, not because either side is irrational, but because the logic of their goals requires it. Let's consider what this looks like going forward, because if you follow the internal logic of this conflict, certain patterns become predictable. The first is expansion through necessity. Right now, the United States is attempting to manage this from a distance. Air power, precision strikes, supporting partners on the ground. But there is a problem with that approach. Once you begin targeting deeper into Iranian territory, once you strike infrastructure and leadership, you create conditions that air power alone cannot resolve. You need to secure assets. You need to hold positions. And the moment you establish a physical presence to do that, you must defend it. Defending it requires expanding your perimeter. Expanding your perimeter creates new vulnerabilities that require additional resources to protect. This is how wars grow. Not through one major decision, but through a sequence of individually logical steps that collectively produce an outcome no one originally intended. Then consider how this conflict draws in other actors. Because none of this is happening in isolation, the Gulf states are already under pressure. They are balancing their own security, their relationships with Washington, and their exposure to Iranian retaliation. If any of them formally enter the conflict, the equation changes significantly. And then there are countries like Pakistan. Pakistan has its own strategic ties in the region. It has internal political pressures, and it possesses nuclear capability. I want to be careful here because I am not saying nuclear weapons will be used. That remains unlikely in the near term. But once a nuclear-armed state becomes even peripherally involved in a conflict at this level of intensity, the decision-making calculus changes for everyone. Every move is evaluated with that capability in the background, and that alone shifts how risks are assessed. There is also the maritime dimension, which tends to be underreported. The global economy depends on a small number of critical choke points, narrow passages through which a massive share of the world's energy flows. If those choke points are disrupted, not necessarily closed, just disrupted, the effects spread through the global economy very quickly. Prices spike, insurance costs increase, shipping routes change, and supply chains that rely on predictability begin to seize up. This is a tool that Iran understands and has the ability to use. If that leverage is applied alongside infrastructure strikes, you get a cascading effect that magnifies the economic damage far beyond what either action would produce alone. On top of all this is the information environment. Reports are incomplete, events are not fully confirmed, there are gaps in visibility that allow rumor and speculation to spread. This is the fog of war, but it is doing something specific here. Uncertainty amplifies fear, and fear distorts decision-making. When governments operate without complete information, under domestic pressure and psychological strain, they tend to make decisions that are more defensive, more aggressive, and more focused on short-term survival than long-term stability. The fog of war is not just descriptive. It actively shapes how conflicts escalate. There is one more dimension that requires serious attention, and that is what happens when leadership is removed mid-conflict. There have been targeted strikes on key individuals, and the instinct is to see this as advantageous. Remove a decision maker, weaken the opponent's command structure, create confusion. But consider what actually happens structurally. As long as leadership on both sides remains intact, there is the possibility of communication, of back-channel negotiation, of some form of resolution. Leaders have the authority to make deals and usually an interest in surviving long enough to see them through. When you remove those leaders, you create a vacuum. And vacuums in conflict are filled by those most capable of asserting control in chaotic conditions. Those individuals are rarely moderate. They are typically more aggressive, more uncompromising, more willing to escalate, because those traits allow them to rise in chaos. So by removing leadership, you do not simply weaken military capacity. You reshape the internal political structure in ways that make future resolution more difficult. You eliminate those who might negotiate and replace them with those whose survival depends on refusing compromise. You do not just escalate externally, you radicalize internally. This distinction is often lost in tactical discussions. This is why historically, targeting leadership has been approached with caution by strategists who think beyond immediate outcomes. The short-term gain of removing a decision maker often comes at the cost of removing the mechanisms through which conflicts eventually end. You eliminate the off-ramps, and once those are gone, the conflict does not resolve. It continues until one side is exhausted or destroyed. And right now, those off-ramps are disappearing. The structures that allow de-escalation are being weakened. Leadership channels that enable negotiation are being targeted. Economic pressures are increasing. Domestic political dynamics on all sides are pushing toward escalation, not restraint. And the ideological dimensions add another layer that makes traditional cost-benefit analysis unreliable, because not everyone involved views this purely through a strategic lens. For some, this conflict carries ideological significance. It is interpreted through frameworks that give it meaning beyond immediate outcomes. When people believe they are part of something historically or even cosmically important, their tolerance for cost changes. Suffering becomes secondary to the larger narrative. And that affects decision-making at every level. Individual fighters, mid-level commanders, political leaders. When they believe the stakes transcend immediate consequences, they accept losses that would otherwise force reconsideration. So what we are seeing is a conflict expanding across military, economic, psychological, and ideological dimensions at the same time. And each dimension reinforces the others. Infrastructure strikes increase economic pressure. Economic pressure intensifies political stress. Political stress drives further military escalation. Military escalation deepens ideological commitment, and the cycle accelerates. There is no single lever that can slow all of this at once. These dynamics are feeding into each other. Project this forward, and what emerges is a conflict that does not contain itself. It spreads. It pulls in more actors. It disrupts more systems. It erodes the conditions necessary for resolution, not because solutions do not exist in theory, but because the practical conditions required for those solutions are being destroyed in real time. When we say this war is getting out of control, we are not referring to the intensity of individual strikes. We are talking about the structure of the conflict itself, the way its constraints are disappearing, the way its internal logic is overriding the preferences of those who might want to slow it down. That is what makes it so serious, because a conflict that reaches this stage begins to follow its own momentum. And at that point, the question is no longer how to stop it. The question becomes how far it will go before it stops itself. And based on everything we are seeing, the targeting decisions, the strategic positions, the domestic political environments, the ideological dimensions, that stopping point is not near, and the consequences will not remain limited to the region. Pay attention to the patterns. Watch the direction. Focus on the underlying logic behind the decisions being made. Individual events will come and go, but the architecture of this conflict, the way it is structured, the way it is evolving, the way it is consuming its own off-ramps, that is what reveals where this is actually heading. And right now, every signal within that structure is pointing the same way. Something changed last night.
Again, I feel like Professor Jiang made another valid point. I don't understand the thinking where they're just wiping out all the influential leaders that in the past they've been successful at negotiating with. I don't understand the logic with that. You have a guy in office, I think it was Kilimani. You take him out. Then his advisor was still in play, but that advisor had been around long enough to be a part of some of the negotiations that's taking place. And that was a channel that at some point was available, because last year there was a 12-day war and there were some discussions that took place, and those same people that was in place was able to de-escalate a situation so that, you know, things could sort of settle down a little bit. You take that guy out. Then I believe they appointed his successor, and within like hours, I think it might have been 12 hours, less than a day, his successor got taken out. So what it's showing is that Israel and the U.S. has some incredible intelligence. It does show that, because how they knew who the successor was and where to get him is bar none very, 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 very intuitive, if nothing else. But at the same time, it shows to the other side that it's personal. That's the impression that I think the other side takes. This matter is personal, and it's so personal that anybody that you could even think of to put in that person's place must also die. You don't even know if that person would have the same ideology, the same convictions, the same passion. The guy hasn't been in the job for a day and he's already dead. So I think what Dr. Jiang is saying here is that, Professor Jiang, he's saying that when it gets to that point where we're making strikes and we're honed in on killing any leaders that gets designated as the next step, we kill them. That's not how we convince these people to come to the table to negotiate with us. For those who don't understand, these are the type of people that don't mind blowing themselves up for what they believe in. I don't think they're afraid by death. To them, they would rather be martyrs than the fact that you killed one of them. It's not somehow making them so fearful of their life that they're going to say, oh no, we just want you to spare our life so badly that we'll do whatever you tell us to do, even though it would mean that we're, negotiating against our own self-interest. I mean, there's ways you could see that to be the case. These are people of conviction. This is the Persian Empire. These are people who's been in power for a long period of time, who have a strong connection to their culture and their origin. They're not just giving it up because we're promising them this democracy that in their view, they view it as evil. I'm not saying that I think it's evil, our democracy is evil, but they view it that way. That's why they, make some of the crazy statements that they make. But at the end of the day, these people aren't afraid to die. Like, to them, it's an honor to die for what they believe in. So when you're constantly killing their leaders, it doesn't signal we want to make a deal. I don't know. Maybe I'm misreading it. I'm not a political expert. I'm getting the information bit by bit, but I'm just using rational thought to piece things together. There are some points where they say don't push somebody against the wall, because when somebody feels like their back is against the wall, they're fighting for their survival. That's why they say don't chase a wild animal or anything and not give it an opportunity to run away. Because if it can't run away, all it can do is fight you for its survival. And it's going to be a ferocious fight because instinctually it wants to live. It tried its best to run away, but if you corner it, it's going to do everything in its power to stay alive. And I think you're starting to see somehow, some way, these guys are getting their bombs through and they're actually landing in some of these places. I think southern Israel got bombed recently, and it was a major bombing. It injured, I think the report said it injured about 118 people, something to that effect. I haven't verified, but it's been talked about through various publications that that's happened. The Iron Dome, I guess, didn't catch all of them. They've caught 90+% of it, but some of those bombs go through, and somehow they got more and more capable bombs who are able to avert those defenses that Israel and the U.S. has. So I just don't believe that the way to peace is by continuing to pour gas on the fire. You know what I mean? Like bombing their infrastructure where they don't have lights isn't going to make them want to do business with you and view you as their liberators. The few people that you might have won over, you're going to lose, in my view. Because now they're going to say, it's one thing we don't like this regime, but now we're going to have to depend on this regime when we don't have any lights. We're going to have to depend on them to defend us for the most basic necessities of life because we're getting bombed. We don't have lights, and it's not safe for us or our children. You're essentially pushing the people into a corner where they're not going to view you in a positive light. They're going to view you as their oppressor, as the cause, as their attacker, not as their deliverer. That's at least how I'm thinking about it. Now, people have different viewpoints, and I welcome people to share their points of views. I mean, this is why we have these discussions. But I think this is what Professor Jiang talks about. It's not something that I think it's politically motivated. I think he's just speaking it based on analysis that he's done. He brought a great point up about the Vietnam War and how there's some parallels between what we did in Vietnam and what we're doing now is that was a whole guerrilla warfare where you were fighting these people in the jungles. That's their terrain. You may outgun them, but they know their terrain. And if you're going to put boots on the ground, and the only way you can keep and secure the gains that you've made is by having boots on the ground. The only way you're going to be able to actually affect the political structure is by having leaders that you're defending that can then, carry out your will on that land. And you need to give them enough support so that they can succeed accordingly. It's possible. Oh, someone just said in the message that the message from Professor Jiang could have been AI. It's possible. I did think about it as I was watching the second message. I thought the first message was a bit more on point. The second message I thought was pretty interesting because his mannerisms was a little off. But yeah, and it's true. He doesn't really speak that clearly. That is true. It's quite possible that it's true. Even with the AI points that was raised here, I'm not saying this is what this man says is not like a message from God. So I don't take his words just on that, but I do think he's raised some good points in it. Even though it may have been AI, I think some of the premise of some of the points that was raised was fair premises to sort of consider. Is that, just thinking about things logically, intensifying a conflict is not necessarily the best way to bring about peace. You know what I mean? Because I don't think these people are going to be intimidated. I think they would rather die, to be honest with me. From what I can see, like these people celebrate their dead in a way that says there are martyrs. They stood up for something. They're not running away trying to self-preserve their life. They would rather be blown up than to cower. That's just they're people of deep conviction. And it's a spiritual conviction. It's an ideological conviction that you can't just, bomb away. Like these people are very convicted in what they stand for and what they believe. And that's why I think this is a sticky situation. Now, whether or not Professor Jiang and, is his predictions will come to pass, we don't know. I hope they don't. I don't want to see the U.S. lose. I don't want to see anything bad happen to the U.S. I do think, though, that, sometimes it's like in boxing, you're fighting and you watch certain fighters. Muhammad Ali, when he fought George Foreman, he just let him throw punches for a lot of the rounds. And I'm sure a lot of people would have been like, man, Muhammad Ali is losing the fight. But what he was doing is he was getting this bigger, stronger guy to exert all his energy, because he knew as soon as he walked him out, he was going to methodically take him apart. After he threw all the punches, now he's heaving. Now he's got no defense. He doesn't move. He's not evasive. Now he's a sitting duck and he can take blows. And that's what I think is happening. There's the part of us that's curious about what our weapons can do, and we're just bombing at will, and we're just bombing and bombing and bombing. And eventually you're not going to have as much ammunition to bomb. And eventually you're going to get a little, your chest is going to puff out. You're going to think, you're going to get comfortable. And now you're going to think it's safe to put people on the ground. And there's 100 million people over there who's been taught from this tall not to like this group of people. These people are probably going to stand up for themselves. And I don't know how that's good. It's just going to require a lot of resources on our part to actually subdue that place. And I don't know that the American people has really that much conviction in the perceived threat of Iran to make that level of sacrifice. I mean, any day now, these food prices could go up, and it's about to be something different. The gas price is going up, and so far people are tolerating it a little bit, but it can't happen a lot of it. The market's crashing, people's retirement accounts is going crazy. You've saved 30 plus years, you're about to retire a couple years away, and then war happens and you lose 40-50% of what you've saved for 30 years. You're going to be upset. You might not vote for the people who did that to you. So this is, I think, is what Professor Jiang is trying to allude to, is that they're fighting up here. They're not fighting with just might and bare knuckles. They're fighting like, the longer we drag this out, the more money you lose, the more pain it causes to you and other people in the world, the more problems you'll have politically, the more divided you'll be internally. These are the type of, things that they're betting on happening. You know what I mean? So again, war is never a pretty thing. I just think that, if you're going to go in, you should have your ducks in a row to the point where you understand what the mission is. It seems like the mission's evolving here. He talked about potentially them taking Karg Island, which is a major revenue generator for them. I wouldn't be surprised. Trump himself has said, take the oil. He's a guy, he's not about to spend all this money bombing you, and he's not going to get anything out of it. And I can't say I don't understand where that comes from. I mean, if you're expending all this money, you might as well get something from it. But even if you do that, I think, again, when you take the oil, you got to have customers. And some people may not want to do business. They may want to, I'll buy it from Russia instead of buying it from you if you're occupying Iran's oil fields. They may want to just do that. Just because they don't like how it came about. You know what I'm saying? They may not, because sometimes your needs are your needs. And if you got to buy it from somebody that, got it underhandedly, it is what it is. You know what I mean? So again, we gotta watch to see how it plays out. But I think there's some validity to that prediction, that it's likely that they'll attempt to take the oil as a means of controlling the major, economic generator for that particular country. But again, it would be one of those things where I think it more infuriates the people more so than make them think positively of you. So again, pushing somebody into a corner is not always the best option. So we just hope, all I can say for the people who are believers, keep our leaders in prayer, man. Whatever it is that's happening, if they're not able to see these things clearly, if there's influences, if there's pressure, we need them to be under prayer so that they can see things clearly. Some people could see it. And, Trump said he couldn't see that Iran was going to attack the petrodollar states. He said he couldn't see it. I don't think Trump lies about things like that. If he said he didn't think it was going to happen, like he just thought they were just going to bomb them and then the people was overtake them and it wouldn't have gotten to that point. I mean, bruh, that's pretty obvious. These people cannot militarily fight you. They know you're stronger than them. You have military weapons that they don't have. You have advantages that they don't have, which is probably the reasons why they were always willing to negotiate in the past. They were always willing to de-escalate. They would call ahead of time and say, look, we're going to attack this. This is a retaliation for what you did to us. We're telling you what it is so you can clear your people. We still have to, make it look like to our people that we're standing up for ourselves. So, they were working with us. And then we kill their leaders, which doesn't make sense to me. I don't know why we would do that. Those are the people that was like, calling us and telling us, hey, we're going to attack this. The 12-day war, they telling you, they gave you a heads up of where they're going to attack. Those aren't people that was really trying to make us their enemy. And then now we're like taking everybody out. I get it. It's impressive how the heck we're able to do it, and somehow they can't do it to us. I think it's hella impressive. Anybody looking at that objectively could say, man, what kind of technology do you have? What kind of intel do you have that you can be so precise that almost 100% of the time, the moment you get a target, that person's off the map? That's impressive to me. I mean, it may not be to some other people, but it is impressive to me. So militarily, we have some advantages. But to me, optically, I think that's where there's some disadvantages, because we're not mindful of how it looks like to everybody else, which is why you have hesitation with people coming on to help. They're sitting it out because they don't think you went about it the right way. You know what I mean? So, but what say you? I invite you guys to go ahead and like and subscribe, stay connected to the show, and let me know what you think about my assessment, the analysis, some of the points that was raised by Dr. Jiang, his predictions. Obviously, let your voice be heard. It's interesting. I'd like to know, if you guys, think he's onto something, if you think maybe, things are gonna, the wind's gonna blow a different way. We definitely want to hear your voice. This whole show, the premise of this whole show is for us to have conversation, to talk about what you guys are thinking, feeling about what's actually happening in the world and pertaining to us. And so, I welcome your voice. I ask that you stay connected, like and subscribe, but also weigh in, share the video, comment, and let me know what you think. All right. That's it for this particular segment. We'll continue to keep you guys up to date and bring different points of views up for discussion. But for now, we will leave this particular conversation here. All right, guys, have a blessed and productive day. So we speak again.